Welcome to the Lote Notes podcast, your briefing on the latest in fire, security, and cyber events shaping today's world. Each episode, we break down the stories behind the headlines, explore emerging risks, and bring clarity to the fast-moving landscape of safety and security. Whether it's real-world incidents, digital threats, or industry trends, we keep you informed, prepared, and ahead of the curve. Let's dive into this week's developments.
Hello, I'm Hazel Swadling.
And I'm Maher Maghrabi. Today, we are going to explore how Australia's critical infrastructure is evolving from compliance-based obligations to true operational resilience in an AI-driven threat landscape.
If we look back at the original intent of the Security of Critical Infrastructure Act, or the SOCI Act, when it was introduced, it was all about giving the federal government visibility over who owned and operated Australia's critical assets. It established a baseline for asset registration, mandatory incident reporting, and the foundation of critical infrastructure risk management programs, or CRIMPs.
Exactly, Hazel. But the critical infrastructure landscape has shifted dramatically. Today, we are moving entirely away from a dry, tick-the-box, paper compliance mindset. The question for asset operators in 2026 is no longer, are you compliant? It is, are your security controls mature enough to withstand sophisticated automated threat vectors?
That's exactly what we're deconstructing today, moving from administrative governance to true operational resilience in an environment heavily accelerated by artificial intelligence.
Yeah, and an important driver here is behind that shift. There is a lot of method, and we found through the independent review of the Security of Critical Infrastructure Act carried out by Dr. Jill Slay that the SOCI Act had increased board level awareness and it improved asset visibility, but also that major legislative change is required to reduce complexity, address regulatory duplication, and make the framework more agile in the face of emerging threats. And these emerging threats are the likes of AI, quantum risk, drones, space dependencies, and supply chain disruption.
Yeah, so when we talk about the 2026 reform agenda, we shouldn't see it as a random tightening of rules. It's better understood as the government's response to the issues identified through that review. A need to move beyond self-attestation and paper compliance and towards clearer obligations, stronger assurance, practical guidance, and measurable security uplift.
Yeah, and to understand why Australian regulation is tightening up so rapidly, we have to look closely at both the operational data coming out of the government and the findings of Dr. Jill Slay's independent review.
Right, many organisations assumed that if they had a well-documented CRIMP signed off by their board, that they were safe. But the Cyber and Infrastructure Security Centre's landmark trial audits completely shattered that illusion.
Yeah, so these trial audits, they exposed massive systemic deficiencies on the ground, specifically a stark lack of formal documented review mechanisms for physical security hazards, alongside completely inadequate personnel frameworks to address insider threats and identify critical workers.
So, in short, organisations were writing policies, but they weren't always building actual operational capability. Dr. Slay's review reinforced this point by calling for the SOCI framework to shift from compliance-driven activity to outcome-driven security uplift. That growing gap between paper compliance and real-world resilience became the primary catalyst for the legislative hammer to drop.
That brings us directly to the major regulatory milestone of 9 June 2026. This was the day that the Security of Critical Infrastructure Legislation Amendment Rules officially came into force under Instrument LIN 2675. In many ways, these enhanced rules reflect the direction of travel identified in the independent review: clearer expectations, stronger government signals, and a move from risk awareness to demonstrable risk treatment.
This is not a vague guideline either. The Minister for Home Affairs and Cybersecurity explicitly designated 6 asset classes that are now legally bound to meet strict enhanced CRIMP requirements. We're talking about critical broadcasting, domain name systems, electricity, gas, freight infrastructure, and freight services.
Yeah, so under these new rules, you cannot just state that you manage cyber risks broadly. You have to explicitly have legally auditable processes in your CRIMP to minimize material risks, such as legacy system neglect, remote access to business critical data, and vulnerabilities in advanced or novel technology deployments.
And the government has drawn a line in the sand by mandating specific technical framework tiers.
Yes, so if you are a responsible entity for these captured assets, your CRIMP must prove that you satisfy highly targeted security benchmarks. This includes the maturity levels, such as maturity level 2 of the ASD, or the Australian Signals Directorate Essential 8, or you meet security profile 2 of the AESCSF, which is the Australian Energy Sector Cybersecurity Framework, or you satisfy maturity indicator level 2 of the C2M2 Cybersecurity Capability Maturity Model, which again provides infrastructure operators a whole host of different models and compliance tracks that they can adopt. But the key idea there is to demonstrate that you are following a system and that you're meeting certain maturity levels.
Yeah, so this means independent, auditable metrics are now directly tied to your legal right to operate. One of the main reasons the Department of Home Affairs is tightening these screws is because artificial intelligence has completely rewritten the threat playbook.
Absolutely. AI is acting as a massive force multiplier for malicious threat actors. It automates network reconnaissance, it speeds up malware generation, and creates highly targeted social engineering campaigns. But it isn't just software we have to worry about anymore. The hardware supply chain is under direct attack.
Yeah, that's a critical point. Look at what happened in May 2025. Media reporting confirmed that undocumented communication equipment was discovered embedded right inside Chinese manufactured solar inverters deployed in the field.
And look, this was a major wake up call for the energy sector. These components contained hidden, unlogged communication channels, specifically engineered to allow remote actors to circumvent standard cybersecurity controls entirely.
Which is exactly why the federal government stepped into the Cybersecurity Security Standards for Smart Devices Rules 2025, which officially commenced on the 4th of March 2026.
Yeah, so this is very interesting because these rules legally mandate that consumer grade smart devices, or IoT devices as we know, distributed energy resources, and household battery networks must be built under secure by design principles. We have to secure the edge of our electricity grid before it can be aggregated and weaponized against our macro transmission networks.
So, beyond the direct technology vectors, the macro logistical vulnerabilities facing Australia's infrastructure operators right now are massive.
Yeah, so the supply chain timelines are brutal. If an incident occurs today, whether it's a natural hazard or a malicious payload or a digital attack, replacing core infrastructure components is an operational nightmare.
Can you give our listeners an idea of what those numbers look like on the ground?
Yeah, so looking at high voltage electricity transformers, lead time for standard units have blown out to something like 120 weeks. If you need a large specialized substation power transformer or a generator step up transformer, you're looking at an unmitigated backlog of 80 to 210 weeks.
Wow, so that's up to 4 years of waiting for a single replacement piece of machinery. If your crimp doesn't explicitly map alternative sourcing or buffer mitigation for these long lead components, a single failure point could easily trigger a cascading sector shutdown. So let's talk practical strategy. Knowing that the 2026 enhanced rules are actively in force and that the threat landscape is hyper-automated, what must security and risk managers change immediately?
Right. So, first, break down your operational silos. AI driven threats do not stop at information technology perimeters. They cut right through physical access systems, procurement networks, and operational technology. So, your physical security teams, cyber divisions, and procurement officers need to be working from a centralized, unified risk register.
Second, focused heavily on third-party data notification obligations. Under the SOCI Act subsection 12F3, if a commercial third-party data provider hosts or processes your business-critical data, you're legally required to notify them of that fact. So this makes them acutely aware of their own downstream security exposures.
And finally, validate your controls through intense operational testing. The regulator can now use last resort review and remedy powers under Section 2A to audit your risk programs. If your crimp is found to have a serious deficiency that poses a material risk to national stability, you will face formal, legally binding intervention directions.
So you can't just say you have a response plan on a shelf. You must run advanced desktop and field exercises to actively prove your team can manage real-world incidents.
Exactly. So the message from the Cyber and Information Security Center is crystal clear.
Regulatory compliance is no longer a shield you can hide behind. Dr. Jill Slay's independent review made that clear, and the 2026 enhanced rules have now permanently shifted the benchmark to real operational capability, effectiveness-based assurance, and verified security maturity.
Yeah, in an age where AI driven threats can strike at unprecedented speed and scale, the true measure of your organization's success is simple. Can you maintain the continuous delivery of essential services to the Australian public when a crisis hits?
That is the defining resilience challenge for the next decade.
Joining me now is Hazel, whose article examines the proposed battery energy storage system in Narrabri and the lessons it offers for community engagement, risk communication, and social impact assessment. Hazel, let's begin with the basics. What exactly is a battery energy storage system?
A battery energy storage system, or BESS, stores electricity generated from renewable energy sources such as solar and wind. That stored energy can then be released later when electricity demand increases or when renewable generation decreases. They're becoming increasingly important because they help address one of the major challenges associated with renewable energy, which is intermittency. They essentially act as a buffer that helps stabilize the electricity network.
From a technical perspective, battery storage seems critical to Australia's energy transition. So what happened in Narrabri?
Narrabri presents a fascinating case study because it's actually a community with extremely high levels of rooftop solar adoption. Approximately 62% of residents have rooftop solar systems. On the surface, that suggests strong support for renewable energy. However, support for renewable energy doesn't automatically translate into support for every renewable technology. When a large-scale battery project was proposed in 2025, significant community concerns emerged, ultimately contributing to the project coming to a standstill and ultimately not going ahead.
What were the main concerns?
Much of the concern centered around safety and perceived risk. Community perceptions were influenced by discussions about lithium-ion battery fires and comparisons with incidents involving smaller batteries found in products such as e-bikes and consumer devices. While those concerns were understandable, they didn't always reflect the substantial differences between consumer batteries and highly regulated utility-scale battery systems. The proposed facility included numerous safety features, including smoke detection systems, automatic shutdown mechanisms, and emergency notification systems linked with local emergency services. Yet many residents remain unconvinced.
So why do you think that happened?
One of the key lessons is that technical information alone isn't enough. Communities need clear, accessible, and trusted communication. If information gaps emerge, they can quickly be filled by uncertainty, misunderstanding, or misinformation. In Narrabri, community engagement occurred, but there appears to have been a gap between the technical complexity of the project and the information that community members received and understood.
And this is where social impact assessments come into discussion, right?
Exactly. A social impact assessment, or SIA, is a structured process used to identify, predict, and evaluate how a project might affect people and communities. Importantly, it's not simply about documenting impacts. It's about understanding local values, concerns, and community dynamics before decisions are made. A well-executed SIA helps project proponents understand how risks are perceived, not just how risks are measured technically.
That's an important distinction. Perception and reality don't always align.
Yeah, that's right. From an engineering perspective, a risk may be considered very low, but if community members perceive that risk differently, those perceptions can still influence project outcomes. Successful infrastructure projects need to address both the technical risk and the social response to that risk, and SIA provides a framework for doing exactly that.
So how can organisations improve community trust on future projects?
So early engagement is critical. Project teams should involve technical experts as part of the engagement process from the very beginning and operate through the filter of effective social impact assessment and community engagement strategies. Communities often have detailed and legitimate questions, particularly when dealing with unfamiliar technologies. Providing credible, accessible information and creating opportunities for genuine two-way dialogue can make a significant difference. It's also important to recognise that engagement isn't simply about delivering information. It's about listening and understanding community concerns. When people feel heard and respected, trust becomes much easier to establish.
What do you think is the biggest lesson from Narrabri?
The biggest takeaway is that project success depends on more than good engineering. Infrastructure projects exist within communities. Even when robust technical controls are in place, projects can struggle if communication, trust, and stakeholder engagement aren't addressed efficiently. The Narrabri case demonstrates how social impact assessment and community engagement should be viewed as essential project components rather than just administrative requirements.
And as Australia continues investing in renewable energy, those lessons will become increasingly relevant.
Yes, absolutely. The energy transition isn't only a technical challenge, it's also a social challenge, and successful projects will need to be addressed in both dimensions.
Now that we've wrapped up our discussion on security and the ways we protect people from external threats, it's a natural step to look at another critical aspect of safety. Not all risks come from intentional harm. Some arise from the environments we live and work in every day. With that in mind, we're shifting our focus to fire safety. It's a different topic, but it carries the same goal: safeguarding lives and ensuring resilience. Let's dive into the next segment.
Joining me for the first part of today's discussion is Jack, whose recent article explores the growing challenge of firefighting water demand associated with renewable energy infrastructure. So Jack, renewable energy projects are appearing across Australia at an unprecedented rate. What's changing from a fire safety perspective?
So the biggest change is that we're now designing for hazards that behave very differently from a traditional building fire. So historically, most fire engineering methodologies were developed around buildings and industrial facilities where the behavior of fire is reasonably well understood. We know roughly how fires grow, how suppression systems interact with them, and what level of intervention firefighters can safely undertake. But renewable energy assets challenge many of these assumptions. Large-scale photovoltaic installations and battery energy storage systems introduce unique hazards that often require entirely different firefighting approaches.
What makes these facilities so different?
The key issue is that many renewable energy systems remain hazardous even during emergency response. So take, for example, a solar farm. Solar panels continue generating electricity whenever sunlight is present. So even when parts of the system have been isolated, responders may still be dealing with energized electrical components. Battery systems create a different challenge altogether. A large-scale battery installation contains thousands of interconnected cells. If one of these cells fails, it can trigger a phenomenon called thermal runaway, where heat generated by a failing cell spreads to adjacent cells and creates a chain reaction. Unlike many conventional fires, thermal runaway isn't always a single event. So it can escalate, can settle down, and then reignite as additional cells become involved.
So firefighters aren't necessarily dealing with a fire that follows a predictable pattern.
Exactly. So in a conventional building fire, the objective is often straightforward. They look to locate the fire, apply water, cool the fuel source, and extinguish the fire. But with a battery fire, this isn't always possible. The affected cells may be buried deep within modules and battery racks, where externally applied water has very limited effectiveness. As a result, emergency response strategies often shift from extinguishment to containment and defensive cooling. The goal becomes protecting surrounding assets, preventing fire spread, and managing the incident safely while the affected battery system burns itself out.
That sounds like it would significantly change water requirements.
It does. So one of the biggest misconceptions is that water demand is based solely on extinguishing a fire. With renewable energy hazards, we're often providing water for long duration cooling operations rather than rapid extinguishment. This means firefighters may require substantial quantities of water for many hours or even several days in some cases.
Your article references a case study from the United States that highlights this issue. Can you tell us a bit about that event?
Of course. So the incident occurred at the Charmont Solar Farm and Battery Storage Facility in New York State. Following a battery cell failure, thermal runaway spread through a BESS container and resulted in a significant fire event. When firefighters arrived, they couldn't immediately begin suppression activities because the site had to first be electrically isolated. That process alone took approximately 8 hours. Once responders gained access, their strategy centered on cooling adjacent battery units and preventing fire spread rather than directly attacking the burning container. The overall response extended across 8 days and used approximately 1.9 million litres of water.
Those are incredible figures. What does that example mean for Australian projects, though?
So it highlights why traditional assumptions around firewater supply are no longer sufficient in some circumstances. For many renewable energy projects, the question isn't simply whether hydrants are available. The real question is whether there's adequate water capacity to support a prolonged emergency response, protect nearby infrastructure, and manage runoff over extended periods. Those are very different design considerations.
How does Australia currently address those risks from a regulatory perspective?
So large-scale BESS facilities are typically treated as special hazards. Rather than applying a simple deemed to satisfy approach, projects generally require detailed fire engineer assessment supported by a fire safety study. The fire safety study examines credible fire scenarios and evaluates how the facility would perform during an emergency. That includes fire spread, suppression strategies, emergency response requirements, explosion risks, smoke impacts, and contaminated water management. The findings often influence the final firefighting water demand for the site.
And water isn't the only issue. You also discuss contaminated firewater.
Yeah, that's right. Battery fires can generate runoff containing electrolytes, heavy metals, and combustion byproducts. If that water enters surrounding waterways or stormwater systems, it can create significant environmental impacts. As a result, we're increasingly seeing retention ponds, bunding systems, dedicated storage tanks, and stormwater isolation measures incorporated into site designs. The objective is to capture and contain contaminated water until it can be safely managed.
So when we talk about firefighting water demand today, we're really talking about much more than just suppression.
Absolutely. Water demand is now tied to operational response, environmental management, and community protection. As renewable infrastructure continues expanding across Australia, we'll need to continue rethinking what adequate fire protection looks like. Ultimately, success isn't just compliance with standards. It ensures facilities can safely manage during a real-world incident.
Jack, thank you for joining us and sharing those insights.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening to the Lote Notes podcast. If you found today's insights helpful, be sure to subscribe and share the podcast with colleagues who care about fire safety, physical security, and cybersecurity. Stay vigilant, stay informed, and join us next time as we continue tracking the events and trends shaping the world of safety and resilience. Until then, stay safe and secure.